Okay, there's a persistent idea that's long been perpetuated that flying is safer than driving. There's various statistics given to support this notion. More recently, an MIT professor, Arnold Barnett, says the death risk for a passenger is 1 in 45 million flights. There's also an argument that per mile flying is safer. It's also said a lot less people die every year from flying than driving. I'm going to show that all these pro-flying statistics are entirely misleading, and they actually underrate the time-based risk. However, as you will see, my result does not show that flying is more dangerous than driving, period, or driving is more dangerous than flying, period. So you will see the result and the explanation at the end. Now, the data that I'm using comes from Boeing's publication, Statistical Summary of Commercial Jet Airplane Accidents Worldwide Operations, 1959 to 2013. And my statistics specifically are based on more recent commercial flights between 2004 and 2013. And jets heavier than 60,000 pounds maximum gross weight. That includes planes like the 707, 727, 737, 747, 757, 67, 77, 87, the DC models, the A300s, and other planes here like the Concords. So basically just popular commercial jets. Okay, so for my comparison, I had to actually create a formula that would describe the risk of flying per time. So there's a lot of formulas, a lot of statistics that suggest that flying is safer based off a per mile argument. So that's actually misleading because the risk of flying is not associated per mile that is flown, but it's rather per time. And one easy way to understand this is just because it doesn't matter whether the plane is going 300 miles an hour and you get X miles out of it, or the plane is going 900 miles an hour and you get a certain miles out of it. What matters actually is the time that's in flight, and that's where you gain a risk of something going wrong, is by time, not necessarily by how fast the plane is going. So the per mile statistics for that reason specifically are misleading. So I had to basically create a formula that described the risk of flying based off time. So, and just to make everything even, I compared the risk of being a passenger on an airplane and being a driver of a vehicle. Okay, so according to the Boeing manual, there's 0.28 fatal rate per billion flights, or about one person dies for every 4 billion flights. Now, that's overrating the risk in terms of being a passenger on the plane, because that includes the fatalities that are external. For example, somebody in a building which a plane crashed into, or somebody on the ground who got killed. So the chances of onboard fatality, and this is based off the Boeing manual, is 96.85% chance. So I just multiplied the 0.9685 times the 0.28 fatal rate per million to get a 0.27118 onboard fatal rate per million flights. Okay, and next I basically compared the flight hours and the amount of departures just to get an idea of what the average flight time is, which becomes useful in my formula. So it turns out that there's 469.5 million flight hours, and that's 221.4 total departures. So the average flight time is 2.12 hours, or 127.2 minutes. Also, for my statistics, it's important to note that the amount of time in takeoff and climb and the amount of time in descent, approach, and landing is roughly constant for any flight. So if you're taking an hour and a half, say, flight versus like a 3-hour flight, the amount of time the plane is going to be climbing to its cruise altitude, and then from there descending into the airport is going to be the same. So with that, basically I've come up with 14.4 minutes of takeoff and climb time, and there's 24.3 minutes of descent, approach, and landing time. And that's coming right out of the Boeing statistical manual. So that makes it a total of 38.7 total minutes in takeoff, climb, descent, approach, and landing phase. It also means that a total of 127.2 average flight time minus constant time of 38.7 minutes in the takeoff, climb, descent, approach, landing phase gives you the average cruise time, which is 88.5 minutes in cruise. Now, it's important to look at these different phases of flight because there's different risks associated with each phase. For the takeoff climb phase, there's a separate risk than the cruise phase than there is with the descent, approach, landing phase. So Boeing has provided the risks associated with each phase, and essentially I've gone ahead and multiplied the 0.28 fatal rate per million flights and multiplied it times the percent risk in each of these phases to get a fatal rate per million flights per phase of flight. Okay, so that 0.27118 onboard fatal rate per million flights, I've kind of gone ahead and broken down the risks associated with each phase of flight, and this was provided again by the Boeing report. So, for example, there's a 22% chance that a onboard fatal accident will occur in the taxi, takeoff, and climb phase, and there's a 58% chance that it will occur in the descent, approach, and landing phase. So, in other words, the difference between that, the 20% that remains is the risk, as the chance of the fatal accident occurring in the cruise phase. Now, because the taxi, takeoff, climb is a constant, which means basically if you're taking a 3-hour flight or a 6-hour flight, the time that you're in taxi, takeoff, climb phase is going to be the same. So the risk is constant. So I took, for example, the 22% chance that the fatal accident would happen in the taxi, takeoff, climb phase, and I multiplied that times the 0.27118 risk per million risk of an onboard fatality occurring. So that's how I got 0.05965 per million chance that the fatal accident would occur during the taxi, takeoff, and climb phase. Now that's constant. So for any flight, whether you're on a 3-hour flight or a 9-hour flight, a 4-hour flight, whatever, the chance of that fatal onboard accident will be 0.05965. And then for the descent, approach, and landing phase, there's a 58% that the fatal accident will occur in those phases. So 0.58 times the 0.27118 would give you 0.15728. So you can see there it's about 3 times more likely that accident will occur during descent, approach, and landing, a fatal onboard accident, than it will occur during taxi, takeoff, and climb. Now that leaves us with the cruise phase. So cruise phase is the 0.15728 per million chance of the accident occurring in the descent, approach, and landing phase, plus the 0.05965 per million chance of the accident occurring in the taxi, takeoff, or climb phase. You take those two and add them up, and you subtract that from the total fatality risk of 0.27118. Then you get the risk of 0.05425 per million. Okay, but here's the thing: this risk in cruise is not constant. Okay, unlike the risk in taxi, takeoff, and climb, descent, approach, and landing. The risk in cruise actually depends on how long you've been in flight. So this risk, this 0.05425 per million, is actually per 88.5 minutes of cruise, which we calculate as being the average cruise. Okay, and from this breakdown, there's a formula that I came up with for the per million chance of being involved in a aviation-related accident with an onboard fatality. So that is 0.5965 per million chance of a fatality during taxi, takeoff, and climb, which is constant, plus the 0.1578 per million chance of the accident occurring between descent, approach, and landing, which is constant, okay, plus the variable, which is the amount of total flight time minus 38.7, because 38.7 is the constant time of taxi, takeoff, climb, and then descent, approach, and landing, 38.7 minutes. So you subtract your total flight time from that, and then you get a cruise time, essentially. And you divide that cruise time by 88.5 minutes, which is the average amount of time in cruise. Okay, and then you multiply that times the 0.05425 per million chance. So the longer that you're in flight, the more the cruise-related risk of the longer your flight, I mean, the more the cruise-related risk of an accident. So that's how I got this formula here. Now, there's also a survival rate associated with the onboard fatalities. So the best I could see, the survival rate was 25%, which means that if you're a passenger involved in an onboard fatality, accident with an onboard fatality in a plane, there's basically a 25% chance that you survive. So you would basically take 75% of the risk. And that would give you the per time risk of dying as a passenger on a commercial aviation flight. Okay, so for driving, I use data from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And it's important to note here the average driver is going 32 miles an hour. It became useful in my formula. But there's a total of 29,989 total fatal crashes. And that's based off 945, what is that, billion? No, I don't even know. Just some huge number of total hours driving time. So there's basically a 0.00000031717 fatal crashes per hour. So that's 0.31717 per million chance per hour of being involved in a fatal accident. Okay. However, just to keep things even, I wanted to make sure that we were excluding certain types of vehicles, for example, motorcycles, any type of large commercial truck or anything like that. So I kept my data. I only used the data for 2-door, 3-door, 4-door, 5-door car fatalities. So that makes 38% of the fatal accidents, which is basically 38% times 0.31717 gives you the 0.1205 per hour chance, per million, per hour chance of being involved in a fatal car accident. Okay, now we are interested in the chance specifically of the driver being involved in the fatal accident. And not only the driver being involved, but a driver that is essentially not at fault. And I did that just to make the comparison a little bit more fair and even, because when you're a passenger on a plane, you cannot contribute much to the accident rate of the plane. But as a driver, you could contribute a lot. You make a big difference as to whether you're going to get into an accident or not. So this is where I had to go into the statistics and fudge with the statistics and stuff and play around a little bit. So I use what's called the FARS database to get the rest of my data for this. as far as database is accessible online. From that, I was able to determine that it's 10,976 total in-car fatalities. Okay, so they're automobile-related fatalities, not pedestrians or bicyclists or motorcycles, but in-car fatalities. And out of that 10,976 in-car, 7,984 are driver fatalities. Again, this is for 2-door, 3-door, 4-door, and 5-door vehicles here. Now here's the tricky part. So I know that those 7,984 driver fatalities were, in large part, I mean, they were drivers who were crazy drivers. You know, they were at fault in some way, so they contributed a lot to that accident. So I had to get rid of the 7,984. I had to reduce that to get a better number. So in a more even comparison. So it's kind of hard to tell if the driver caused the accident, if they were at fault, and the driver is dead, like a lot of these drivers are, then they're not going to get a ticket. In most cases, they do not get a ticket. Now, I was able to determine this in a different way. What I did was I took the some statistics that were related to whether the driver was charged and whether a driver was not charged in minor accidents and severe injury accidents. So, and then I was able to make a correction to the driver fatality to find out what is the chances that out of these 7,984 drivers, what are the chances that they were not at fault? Okay. So you could see here the drivers involved in minor accidents, 407 were charged, and 1,056 were not charged. The drivers involved in a severe accident with severe injury, 385 were charged, and 1,082 were not charged. So if you look at these ratios here, they're I guess in the same range. For the severe injury case, it's 2.810 to 1. So, but when you look at the drivers who took a fatal, who basically died, only 235 were charged. Now it's kind of weird charging a dead driver, but I guess for insurance purposes they do. Or the driver may have not died immediately; they might have dragged him to the hospital, and they might have died later, so they wrote him a ticket. But anyways, if you look at it says 235 were charged and 7,749 were not charged. So look at the difference there. That's like, I think, 37 times the difference. So the vast majority of the drivers that die are not going to be charged. Okay. So I made a correction. Okay, I made a correction here. And what I did was I used the rate from the severe injury case, and I just applied that to the fatal injury case. So basically, that 7,984 driver fatalities, to estimate how many of those drivers were indeed at fault, I used that 2.810 ratio. And I did a little bit of math here, okay? And I basically came up with there would be 5,889 drivers who died, who were essentially at fault, whether they were charged or not. They were essentially at fault. And then there was 2,095 drivers who should not have been charged and died. So that's how I made a correction to that 7,984 driver fatalities, because I wanted to make sure that we were making the comparison even and meaningful. So that's how I got my next statistic. Okay, so basically 5,899 drivers were not at fault out of the total 10,976 crashes involving an in-car fatality, whether that be a passenger or a driver, whatever. So we were interested in the driver cases. So basically there's a 5,889 divided by 10,976 chance, or a 0.5365 or 0.65% chance that a in-car fatality will be a non-fault driver. So that's very important here in this comparison. So to recap, you start with a 0.317 per million per hour chance of being in an automotive-related fatality. That could be pedestrian-related, motorcycle-related, whatever. Okay, and then 38% of that, because the rest of fatalities are small trucks, bicycles, pedestrians, whatever type of like snowmobiles or whatever, which we want to exclude. We only are interested in in-car fatalities. So that's 38% of that rate is going to be an accident involving an in-car fatality, and then what you do is you calculate the risk of that being a driver-related fatality. So the driver-related fatality, again, is 53.65% of that. So that 53.65% of that gives you a total risk of 0.0646 per million per hour chance of being a driver and being not a non-fault driver and getting killed on the road. So the formula from that is just the number of minutes driving divided by 60, and then you just multiply times 0.0646, and that's your per million chance. Okay. So if you look at the formula here, we can actually go ahead and do a comparison. We'll just do a comparison for, let's say, an hour 27.2 minutes, which is like the average flight, and see what happens here. One moment. Okay, so for an average flight of 127.2 minutes, the risk is 0.27118 per million. But remember, I'm using a survival rate of 25%. Now that was published somewhere. I'm going to go with that figure, the 25%. Okay, so the risk is essentially 75% of that 0.27118 that you as a passenger will be killed. So 0.2034 per million chance of dying as a passenger on a 127.2 minute flight. Now, the same time for the risk associated while driving for the same amount of time, the 127.2 minutes, is essentially 127.2 minutes divided by 60 times the 0.046 per million per hour chance of dying. So that gives you a 0.137 per million chance of dying as a non-fault driver. So that's about a 1 hour commute to work and back, which a lot of people do. Now, that is about, not quite half, but that is significantly less risky than the risk associated with flying. So it's actually 1.4. Flying is actually 1.48 times. So it's about 1.5 times, 1.5 times more risky for a 127.2 minute flight. Now, for a 4-hour flight that's 240 minutes, you just use the formula, and the risk with a survival rate included is 0.2552 per million chance of dying as a passenger on a plane. And in a car, if you use the formula 240 divided by 60, then times 0.0646 per million per hour chance of dying as a non-fault driver, you get 0.2584 per million. So that is a point, a 4-hour flight is a point where both flying and driving are relatively about as risky. So they're about even at a 4-hour flight. For an 8-hour flight, I did the formula. I got 0.36555 per million chance, and that would be for flying, and 0.5168 per million chance in a car. So from here we see the trend then. So the longer the flight, the risk of dying becomes relatively less and less. Okay, so for short flights, like 2-hour flights, which are typically like intranational flights, where you're flying, say, from like Boston to New York or whatever, the risk associated with flying is greater. At the 4-hour mark, or if you're doing a 4-hour flight, for example, going overseas, say like Florida to Canada or something like that, then the risks are about the same. And for 8-hour flights, or basically anything beyond 4 hours, the risk associated with flying, it actually becomes less and less. So that's as far as I could tell, that's the truth. Now, one thing I could have done is, for a more accurate figure, is to adjust the survival rate based on what phase of flight the accident is likely to occur. So, say on longer flights, there may be more of a chance altogether that the accident will occur in cruise phase, for example, and perhaps it's the case that in cruise phase, if an accident occurs, the survival rate's lower, so the number would be adjusted actually. So I could have done that for a more accurate figure. Now, if I see a mistake anywhere, if you see somewhere where I may have goofed in my numbers and my formulas, then just go ahead and point it out. Just go ahead and comment below.